about this concept and a whole slew of other conversations we will be having on this extraordinary topic with you and our audience. I want to first come and introduce our dear guests and panelists. They have enterprise experience, they have business experience. They also are very dedicated to the community and building the community at large in various capacities. We have shared with you their biographies, and I look for you to take a look at that. And I invite you to indulge in that to get some insight into their backgrounds. It's quite worthwhile. I would like to first welcome Haj Furat Ali Yasin onto the show. Assalamu alaikum, Haj. Thank you for joining us.
Wa alaikum assalam, brother. Thank you for having us. Thanks to you and to the Mainstay Foundation. We're looking forward to benefit, inshallah, from this session.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I'd like to welcome our guest, Brother Shabbar Dhalla, onto the show as well. Assalamu alaikum, Brother Shabbar. How are you?
Alaikum salam. Assalamu alaikum, Brother Sayyid Shabeer and Furat. And it's an honor to be here. And inshallah, we'll have a good discussion.
Absolutely. Lovely to have you guys. So let's get straight into it. I just wanted to start laying the groundwork. Some of you may be thinking like, business entrepreneurship, I never saw myself in that capacity, or it never came on my radar. Or you may be thinking, for example, what does this have to do with Islam? What does it have to do with my religion? What does it have to do with my faith? This may be a totally secular topic in nature. And I want you to invite and consider that we as Muslims look at Islam as a complete way of life. And in that, my life entails my family life. It entails the aspects of sleep, of food, of hygiene, of every dimension. Therefore, how can it be that a big proportion of my life, that is waking up in the morning and coming home in the evening, or even doing that virtually, in seeking a livelihood, seeking a sustenance, this has not been commented on in the text, in the faith? How can that possibly be? And when we look at the text, we find there is a rich history of this, that this is part and parcel of our faith as Muslims, to seek a halal sustenance, a halal livelihood on one side. And also there are numerous verses in the Quran, as well as the traditions, when we'll get to this with our team, with our panel, about what the Quran has said about this, what the Ahlul Bayt have said about this, and ultimately how business and entrepreneurship can be a vehicle for doing good in our society, for doing good in our communities and building it. We talked about in previous episodes the idea of media, the idea, and we will be talking about the idea of civic engagement, being involved in the political process in our respective countries. This conversation is also very important. I want to start by highlighting one aspect of the life of Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen. Our Imam, many times we hear about this example when he married the lady Fatima al-Zahra, that at that point in time, he was of very humble means. However, there was a point in time, if you go to Usul al-Kafi, one of our most authentic books of tradition, you'll find a narration that says Ali ibn Abi Talib, Amir al-Mu'minin, with his own money, freed over 1,000 slaves. Now, I invite you to consider this. This is the same man, when certain individuals came to his office when he is running the state, the Muslim empire, if you will, they come to him on a personal matter and they want to sit and have a conversation with him. And there's a candle on the desk. When this candle's on the desk, these two individuals come in wanting to ask for some more subsidy from the Baytul Mal, from the public treasury. And at that moment, he takes, as soon as he sees them, not knowing, of course, he's the Imam, he knows, but for the public eye, not knowing what they're going to be asking, they have not asked their question yet. He takes the candle that's on the desk, lights the candle that he takes out of his pocket, puts that new candle on the desk and extinguishes the original one. When asked why he did this, he said, look, you came here on a personal matter. This particular candle was lit with the money of the people, the public treasury. You are here on a personal matter. Therefore, I took out my personal candle. This individual, on one side, the equity, the egalitarian nature, and the honesty and the justice of Ali ibn Abi Talib. This same person with his own money is freeing 1,000 slaves. How did that happen? That Ali would never take anyone else's money and misappropriate it in any way, shape, or form. That means that he had built a wealth. And if you study the life of Amir al-Mu'mineen, in particular during the 25-year period where his right was taken, he had dedicated his life to what we would now call development and property and things of this sort. On top of that, we have numerous traditions, which I hope to get into in a moment. But before we get there, is someone who's working or has a job, is that not allowed in Islam? Well, I would invite you to follow your marja on this aspect and the scholars who have commented on this. But There are examples of Nabi Musa alayhi salam, for example, and his working, or for example, Ali ibn Abi Talib early on, where he worked for some time. But this was more of the exception as opposed to the norm. And we'll get into that, about how rich this conversation has been about developing. I also want to highlight this idea that how much social good you can do with the wealth that you accumulate. Sometimes we think that wealth is a negative thing. You see, wealth may very well be a vehicle. It may be a tool. I can choose what I do with that. I can, for example, fund Imam Bargah's, Husayniyas, Masajids, for example. I can help, for example, maybe establish Islamic schools. I can help in a variety of different ways. But also perhaps I can use that in a negative way and indulge. The question is, where is the ethics? As Amir al-Mu'mineen is attributed to have said, that wealth and power do not change a man, rather they expose him. So what you already have within you becomes more exalted, but it becomes more manifest, if I can say, when you have those things. Therefore, I've said quite a bit, and there's a lot to get to, and we will be getting to your questions, some of which have already started to trickle in. We're really excited. But Hajj Furat, if I can come to you on this idea of the Islamic narrative of business and commerce and entrepreneurship. Has Islam said anything about this? I know you come from quite a renowned scholarly background and scholarly family that's quite well known. And I just wanted to know if you could share some insight on that front. What does Islam say about business, commerce, and entrepreneurship?
Well, first of all, thank you for your very beneficial introduction. And indeed, if we want to talk about entrepreneurship and business as Muslims, we need to know what Islam has said about that. And there's a wealth of traditions from Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam that highly encourage entrepreneurship, business, what they call tijara in the riwayat, which is basically translated to trade or commerce. And I will share a few with you today. And I've paraphrased them because I've translated them from Arabic to English. And to demonstrate the weight of commerce in Islam, Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam says, engage in commerce, may Allah bless you. For I have heard Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi says that rizq, sustenance, livelihood is in 10 parts. 9 parts are in commerce and everything else is in 1 part. So this shows you how important commerce is in Islam and how deep the connection is between our tradition and building businesses and engaging in commerce. And in another narration, Amir al-Mu'mineen says, practice the various trades, for there is in them independence for you from what is in the hands of others. And indeed, Allah loves the one gainfully engaged in a trade or a profession. So this shows you the why. Why is it so important? Because it gives you independence. And this is a strategic direction for the whole community. Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam sheds light about the same topic to 2 of his companions. He says to one of them, preserve your glory. And the companion answers, what is my glory? He says, engaging in your market, engaging in commerce and being generous to yourself. And this goes back to generating wealth to be independent, but also to be generous to oneself, family, community. Another companion said to him, came to the Imam Sadiq alayhi salam and said, I have made it. I don't need to engage in commerce anymore. In other words, I've made enough money that I don't need to work anymore. And the Imam said to him that if you stop your trade, your intellect will diminish. And there are narrations that encourage trade because it improves one's intellect. And finally, Imam Ali alayhi salam says, when we speak about commerce, there's another component that's really very, very essential, which is knowledge. So he says, oh merchants, knowledge first, then trade itself. And he repeats it 3 times. He says, knowledge first, then trade. Knowledge first, then trade. And it's really very important that before we engage, we know what the tradition says, but we also educate ourselves. We find that most of us, when we want to get into business, we jump into marketing and strategy and finance, and we start to think about the mechanics of starting a business. But what's really important also is to understand what Islam says, the ahkam, for example, the fiqh point of view of engaging in what are the ethics of being a Muslim businessman? What is my limitations? Because you engage in finance and in various aspects, you're dealing with people, there are rights on you, on others. So it's really very important. And if you allow me, I'll just touch on what some of our scholars say about the topic, and because our scholars are our fathers, really, without whom we are orphans. And I go to a document which I really encourage all of us to read, and you can Google. It's called Advice from His Eminence Sayyid Ali Sistani, may Allah prolong his shadow and the shadow of all our scholars, to the believing youth. It's translated into English, and it's 8 points, guidance by Samahat Sayyid. And I'm only going to read one of the points to you, that's most relevant to our discussion today. And it's point number 3. And Samahat Sayyid says, and it elaborates on the traditions that we just heard. And Samahat Sayyid says, try to learn a trade and acquire a specialty and exhaust yourself in that pursuit. There are many blessings in this. It occupies a portion of your free time. You can support yourself, your family, benefit society, do good deeds using the money that you earn. Sharpen your mind, broaden your experience, and your wealth becomes blessed. That is because the harder wealth is earned, the more blessed and pleasant it is. Furthermore, God, the exalted and immaculate, loves the hardworking person, and who exhausts himself with work and trade, and dislikes the idle person who is dependent on others and spends his time in play and diversion. Do not waste your youth without learning a trade, back to trade, right? Or a specialty. God the glorified has put in youth bodily and spiritual energies so that a person can acquire skills he can use for the rest of his life. Do not waste and play and be negligent. So with that, I think we can establish a very strong foundation to go into the actual topic, inshallah.
Ahsan. Thank you so much, Hajj Furat. Very, very well stated. That this idea that Islam has laid a foundation about this idea of what we should be pursuing, of course, within the parameters of ethics and all of these things which have been highlighted and we'll be highlighting. Brother Shabbar, if I can come to you on this idea of, now that we understand that from an Islamic perspective, Islam has commented on this, this idea of business being a vehicle for social good and actually upliftment. I remember a comment from the previous dean of Harvard Business School, where he was talking about, he was very young when he understood the importance of business. When one of the companies that his father was working with, they brought a series of jobs opportunities to a rural village in India. And he said over time that the dynamics of that entire village shifted. So people who did not have income at one point in time, their way of living, their standard of life, their quality of life, it improved substantially. And that same city over a 15, 20-year period was totally different. There's this narrative of, capitalistic markets, socialistic markets, which is a big discussion in the 20th century and kind of still continues. Veering away from the politics, but the idea of Islam may have an idea on this as well, about how do I use my career, my business, and what I do as a force of good. And so the question I'm really getting at here is there a humanitarian, is there a secular, is there a communal or community level benefit of endeavoring and engaging in business in our societies?
Thank you very much, Sayyid Shabeer. I think that's a very important discussion when you look at holistically why anybody would go into enterprise or into business or into being your own consultant or being self-employed in what you do. If you take a slightly more helicopter view as to why would somebody want to do that, apart from the foundation that Brother Furat has laid out from our Islamic perspective, our communities are built on families, right? Because a community is a collection of families. Families is a collection of individuals. The stronger the family, the stronger the community. Now, when you strengthen the community, you can only strengthen it by its strongest members. And if its strongest individuals or families go into enterprise, they are moving away from dependency to independence, right? And suddenly the dynamics change. This isn't saying that everybody has to become a millionaire or hugely wealthy. It is about taking control of your own destiny, being the captain of your ship, to navigate to where you want it to be. Now, some of them will have a small speedboat, others will have a massive 60-foot yacht. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you have that ability to move it into that direction, because it then fits in with your higher purpose as to why are we here in today's world. We are here in today's world, yes, to earn a halal living, but at the same time to make a difference. That is where this whole notion of enterprise being a force for good, because if you look at some of our communities, within the Shia communities, where they have done extremely well in business, then automatically they create jobs. They automatically then start funding and become angel investors in other businesses. So they're now perpetuating this entire notion and then doing social enterprise work, right? So a good example is what Brother Furat is doing. They have set up Tijafi School, a virtual school that doesn't run on its own, and it needs people to be paid. So there are people earning a living out of it, but it has all the social good that can come out of it. You look at some of the social enterprises that are going on, and I can only speak of UK because I'm based in the UK, but there's a huge amount of social enterprise that is solving problems, but at the same time allowing people to be free through their own enterprise, whether that is through coaching, whether that is through Islamic works, and there is a huge amount of issues that can be solved. You look at some of the charitable work that people are doing, exactly the same thing. Effectively, what you're doing is you're making a cornerstone of Islam has always been business and enterprise for the greater good. It has never been business for the purpose of business or business for me and me alone. It has always been business for the purpose of greater good, right? And you can extend it to the point of saying, look, when you look at Islam's birth and the way it spread because of Bibi Khadija's support and help to the Prophet. One of her biggest cornerstone was trade. But that trade was not for herself only, because she gave away all that wealth in the name of Islam. She earned a lot more out of it, but it was that enterprise that allowed that momentum to build. And strategically, when we talk of strategy, right, strategically, it enabled the prophets to be in a position of power, saying, I don't need the other tribes as much, because you can't undermine the proposition of faith and what Islam stands for, right? So there's a huge scope and room for social enterprise and greater good by effectively being independent.
Very, very well stated. I remember reading a tradition that's attributed to Ahlul Bayt that actually says the best aid to faith is wealth. And one may think, how does that work? The best aid to faith? I thought it was salah, I thought it was saum, I thought it was, ibadat. And the idea in the interpretation by the scholars was, well, all of these institutions that we need in our community require wealth. To add on to your point about Lady Khadija, whether it's the mosques or the masajids or the Husayniyas, or it's the schools that need to run or whatever, they require funding. And to use that wealth for good. There's a book that I invite our audience to consider about the power of business enterprise. There's a book by Max Weber, who's one of the fathers of sociology. It's called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, where he argued that the reason America became America was because of Calvinist Protestant faith. And this idea that they believed in a predestination belief that people who are going to heaven are already determined and people who are not are determined. So they were looking for signs of who are the people who are going to heaven in their belief system. And they said somebody who does good for their community through their business is somebody who is, as we would call from Jannah, someone from Jannah, someone from paradise, and Jannah. That is, they took the excess wealth and they didn't indulge necessarily in luxuries. Rather, they used that to build schools, hospitals, whatever was needed for society. And what happened over time was that spiritual element kind of left by the wayside, is what sociologists said, and it gave rise to capitalism on its own, so which took on a life of its own. Interestingly, even Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations, who everyone studies this in a fundamental economics course, he said that the idea of building, the middle class and the lower class of societies should consider building luxury goods which the wealthy buy. And the argument that he was making was what ends up happening as a result of this is it equalizes wealth and income in society. Yet the threat and the risk, which he kind of alluded to, and which has happened in our modern society, is now the dynamics and the tables seem to be shifted, that the middle class and the lower economic classes of society are now buying luxuries that are produced by the wealthy class of society. And many times they do this on credit. And so it leads to a haves and have-nots, a economic discrepancy in society. Therefore, when we talk about this, we're talking about something that can help build society rather than break it down. We're talking about enterprises and endeavors that can help strengthen our community. So building on that, Haj Furat, if I may come to you, I wondered, and it may be interesting to our audience about, your personal journey, how you got into business. How was this something that came on your radar? In many of our communities, the idea is go to college, get a strong degree, and get a job, a stable, safe job. And that may be very good in one capacity. I'm not against education. I'm in grad school myself, so I think my actions speak louder than the words there. But this idea of the risk or sustenance has been ordained by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that risk is something that you will get. There's two types, as we're told, one that will seek out you and one you have to seek out. But that bare minimum you will. And where does this concept of tawakkul and trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that if you do the hard work and things of this nature? So I was wondering, in your personal journey, how did you get into this entrepreneurial journey or trap, if I can use that as a joke?
Yeah, I mean, most of us, when we think about entrepreneurship, we look at the bright side. We all see the challenge of entrepreneurship, but then we always look at that if I become my own boss, I have the freedom and I have all these things, and I can generate a higher income than the one that I would have generated at my job. And for sure, the freedom of having to go in the direction that you want is something that is amazing. And for me to imagine to go back to a job where you have to log in and log out is something that I couldn't imagine myself doing at all. But that comes with a responsibility, a very big responsibility. And as your business grows, your responsibilities grow. And especially when you have people working with you as a team, they depend on this business to survive, for their own sustenance. Not only that they depend, but they also expect that as things move forward, they grow with the company, right? So the more you grow, the bigger your commitments, and responsibilities grow with it. But it is something that I highly encourage everyone to do, because that freedom, the positive aspect, Haji Shabbar mentioned, being able to contribute to society, being able to use that experience to do the things that you love to do, that you're passionate about, is one of the most rewarding elements of it. And it was one of the biggest drivers for me to have that freedom, but the economic freedom as well, that can then enable community contribution, community building, and all the good things that we all dream to do and want to do.
Very good. Thank you for sharing
Brother Furat has busted my bubbles. I thought my 9 to 5 is finished now. I'm my own boss. I don't have to work. But if I can add on to what Brother Furat has said, I spent 15 years as an employee, working for some different bits, and then went off on my own. And I think when it comes to whether I will earn more or less, let me tell you this: if for the first 3 or 4 years, I earned half of what I was earning as an employee before things started stabilizing. But the one thing I had was flexibility to do what I needed to do. The fact that I could go and pick up my kids without having the need to worry. the fact that my wife would tell me to go doing the school runs, which I still refuse to do. Those small things make a huge difference. The fact that on a Friday I decided that, you know what, I am going to go for Jum'ah at Stanmore because I can. I'm not in the city anymore. I can do that. I will stop it when I want to. The fact that I put 18-hour days is fine. As the Riwayat says, you have to put hard work. But the sheer joy of being able to be the master of your own destiny, I don't think money can buy that. And I think that is the key when it comes to enterprise.
And just to add to that as well, like I fully agree with Brother Shabbar with all these little bits that are so valuable that we can't give up. Absolutely not. But really, certain elements like trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala becomes much stronger. Because, and Brother Shabbar knows, at times it becomes very difficult, you know, especially when you go through these economic cycles. Some things are completely out of your control. There's nothing you can do. The economy is, you know, your sector has gone down, or the economy, or COVID-19 has hit and the whole industry has gone to freeze. What do you do? How do you know, manage? And in those critical moments, it's really the opportunity to develop that relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the trust and tawakkul that my brother just mentioned, absolutely right. And that's one of the biggest joys as well of doing it, is that you explore certain things in your life, in your journey towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that entrepreneurship and being like practicing the actual trade helps you with.
And I think life is like an ECG, right? As a businessman, it just keeps on going this. It goes from, I can do this, I am going to do this, oh my God, why on earth did I ever do this? I should go back. Oh my God, no, I can't do this. I'm about to jump now. I've had enough to, no, I can do this. I got that contract and I am going to do that. And I think it just keeps on going and keeps on going. But what it does is it grounds you to your prayer mat, whether that's in mosque or at home. It really hones in your trust in God, right? That the unshakable faith that actually, no, there is a higher purpose and there's a higher being who will look after me if I just keep doing what I need to do, keep learning, keep innovating, and he has got my back. And that's an odd feeling to get when you think, you know what, I can't do this anymore. And you pray to God and suddenly you see this window of opportunity to think, I am going to create a change.
Very well stated. I think I remember, and I'd invite our audience to consider, there's a podcast entitled How I Built This in the US. It actually documents entrepreneurs' journeys and how they built companies, which are now pretty renowned. But I remember hearing the story of Southwest Airlines, if I recall correctly, in the United States. And they had to actually struggle with, I think, a 7-year legal battle before they got off the ground, no pun intended, as an airline. And so one of the things that the founder said, if there's one trait that you would say that an entrepreneur needs, what would it be? And he said, pertinacity. He said, persistence and tenacity. You gave me one word, so I couldn't put it in one, but I created my own. And I think that's maybe true for all entrepreneurs, that level of persistence. I know data in US is very clear that most entrepreneurs, and I would invite our audience to really consider this, if you start on something, it doesn't work right away. Most entrepreneurs in America don't succeed on their first or second venture. Actually, they succeed on their third or fourth. And that's not to demoralize you. That's actually to say that there's such valuable lessons that are learned in the first and second venture that you apply to the third and fourth that make you much more likely to succeed in that endeavor. And persistence actually can play a very, and tenacity can play a very valuable role in the ups and downs and the highs and lows of this journey of entrepreneurship. If I can come to Brother Shabbar on this one, the question I wanted to ask here was, well, people are tuned in and they're really wanted to get into this idea of, well, where do you start? And that really comes with this idea of generation. How do you kind of come up with these ideas to start a business? Because somebody may be working a job, a 9 to 5 so-called, and they're like, well, It sounds like an interesting conversation, but I don't know where to get started. Where can I start getting ideas about pursuing business? What would you say to someone like that?
So I'd tell somebody two things. One, there is no magic bullet. So don't expect to wake up one day and think, I'm going to be the next Elon Musk. And maybe you will, but generally it doesn't happen. Any idea is a good idea. And the second one is have lots of these with lots of people, right? I'm having green tea, have lots of coffee and teas with lots of people. So if somebody is in a 9 to 5, I was in a 9 to 5 for 14, 15 years of my initial working life, right? Before I jumped into enterprise. It gave me some invaluable lessons that are useful to today. So it built my foundation. But I spent a lot of time talking to people as to how and what is happening around. And I'm not in an industry which is unique. I'm not developing anything that is so different that it's not out there. I'm in the healthcare sector. There's a whole lot of other players in it. But every sector needs more players. There is, as they say, the pie is big enough for everybody's share. And as long as you're happy with your share, you will get it. My biggest advice is talk to people. Do not be scared to have a gathering and talk about business. What is going on? What is an opportunity that is arising? If somebody is a 9 to 5 take COVID as an example. The world has turned upside down. But if you focus purely on economics and commerce, who have done well? A lot of people have suffered. But those who were able to innovate and change have survived. There is so many opportunities to do things online now. Start a side hustle. Try it, fail it, while you still have your other enterprise going on. And this whole concept of having multiple small enterprise that will actually get you to where you need to be at. My biggest advice to people is don't be scared to talk to people. Just have a conversation. Keep on talking to people. I remember when I was building my startup with another friend of mine from Birmingham. I went to see another friend of ours in the city, and I said, look, I have this idea. The guy tore it to pieces, right? That, coming out of there, I'm thinking, why on earth am I even trying to do this? It's time just to go back to my old job. It's probably faster. But you know what? He gave me the best advice because he allowed me to innovate and change to be able to deal with every obstacle that he put in front of me. And the more I could answer his challenges, the more the business became stronger, right? So my biggest advice to people is don't be scared. It's a scary jump, but as soon as you jump, suddenly you will get a parachute. And that will come from the above, that you're doing it for the right purpose. And suddenly that parachute will open. But just talk to people. There is so many people out there. I've always said, and I said this to you when we initially spoke, our biggest asset is not our bank account. It's this. How many people we can talk to. The more people you can talk to, the more people you can build a personal relationship, the faster you will get into your journey.
Very, very good insight about that. The importance of networking and the concept of networking and building from there, talking to people, not being afraid of doing that. And sometimes people will tell you what they need. They may not know it even, but they may give you that gold, so to speak. And I think this also depends for our audience, kind of on what industry or what type of dynamic you're trying to go into. There's different models of business. I think it's fair to say there's a lot of different ways to do business. There's no one size fits all. There's no clear. Everyone, Hajj Furat may do it a different way. Brother Shabbar may do it a different way. I may do it a different way. And interestingly, we all may succeed, but just a very different path to get to that ends. So I wanted to highlight a couple of things. I know that MIT, in terms of entrepreneurship, when they teach it, by the way, heavily focused on the tech sector and innovation on that side. The first question to ask is really, who is your customer? Identifying the customer persona and understanding like what makes them tick, to really have a very attuned. So I can give a practical example for our audience is really highlighting, look, who is your target customer? Are they a 35-year-old, married, unmarried, children? What do they buy? All these expenditures, that person should be as real as someone you can touch. That's the level of granularity you want to go to if you're doing a startup, a tech startup, for example, or other type of a startup. And this is the first question. The second question is then, what can you do for your customer? like once you've identified them. And that's, I think, a big thing that comes up to Brother Shabbar's point as well is, there's companies, there's Silicon Valley in America is filled with companies who got persistent no's and eventually got a yes. And now they're maybe a multi-billion-dollar company. One example is Robinhood, which many people may be aware of. They got, I think, 73 no's before they got funding. But now today, they're a multi-billion-dollar company. You see, the idea is, I think to Brother Shabbar's point, there's no bad ideas. It's all about really execution once you get that good idea. Now, that doesn't mean you can't validate ideas. Another thing that came up was, how we do business. There's a book called Rework that I would invite our audience to consider. Mark Cuban, who's a well-known entrepreneur in America. I think you guys have Dragon's Den over there. We have Shark Tank, the entrepreneur show, right? And he's one of the sharks on Shark Tank in America. He owns the Dallas Mavericks. He said, I would rather have somebody who's read the book Rework than somebody who has an MBA. That's how much I value the insights of this book. He said that, so he was arguing, in that book, they've made a compelling case of why running a startup, you can do it in 9 to 5. That's their view, of course, how they operate. They say that, well, people after a certain amount of hours, they're not that productive anyways. People start putting inflationary hours. It's not about the effort volume. It's rather about quality. And so that's one way of doing it. Now, obviously, I can hear all the different entrepreneurs saying that that's not my world. There's also another book I'd recommend called Smart Cuts. This idea that, making shortcuts, but not shortcuts, smart cuts, like working smarter as opposed to harder to get further and accelerate. Another insight is a very, very classic book called The Lean Startup, which I would highly recommend our tech startup-based community to consider, that talks about iterating, like minimal viable products. So rather than waiting a month, 2 months, 3 months, and way down the road to launch your product, you create a bare bones minimum version of it and then test it with your audience and say, well, what's working, what's not working, and then you improve it. And you build it and then you launch it that way, rather than just putting something at the market and it flops. Rather, you have an ongoing conversation with your customer. There's a lot that can be said here. I'll pause there. I want to get Haj Furat's insights on this, if you will. What advice would you give to our audience about how do I get ideas on how to start or build a business, whatever that may be?
Sure. So I just want to reiterate what Brother Shabbar mentioned, because it's really a very important point about relationships. And if I could give you one piece of advice to, like, your most strategic asset ever in your business are going to be genuine relationships. And I would really highlight the word genuine. They're not just interest, you have an interest with someone, so you establish a relationship. No, it's a genuine relationship where you build up that relationship within the parameters that you want, and you develop it, and you do it consistently across the board. So networking, going to trade shows, for example, whatever your sector is, your industry is. If you're interested in, the food industry, then where's the nearest trade show, your annual trade show or seasonal trade show about food, fast food, whatever it is that you're doing. Go there, meet companies, talk to them, pick up those business cards, and then build the relationship. And the same with the network around you. There may be some friends, families that build the relationship. In the most difficult times and in the best times, it's always those relationships that come through for you. It's not the bank account. It's like Brother Shabbar said, it's nothing else. This is the most important one. And to go to another very good point, which Brother mentioned, is to establish consultants so if you're going to start up a project, pick 2 or 3 and who have experience and that usually they're around you in your social environment around you, and consult them and use them as mentors. And usually it's good to have 2 or 3. So you meet the first one, you write down all the notes, then you go to the next one, and then you hear what they have to say, and then bounce off the ideas from the first consultation to the second one to see what he or she has to say about those comments, and then come up with an idea, come up with a plan, and do that consistently. And I highly recommend to focus on this point. It also helps you to go into another very important point, which is evidence-based management. The whole world now, especially the companies at the forefront, they're all now data-driven. You see the biggest demand right now, especially in the United States and Europe, is for data scientists. those who can analyze data. Why? Because companies now don't make decisions anymore without referring to solid data. And maybe that's a far step for us at the starting point, but it's very, very important that every time you make a decision, your decision is based on some form of fact, some form of idea that you've verified. Don't believe in common wisdoms, and don't trust your instinct, because your instinct isn't always right. And I think Brother Shabbar is smiling. You'll hit so many, barriers when you just depend on instinct alone. And you can really accelerate your business so much faster if you just cut that waste, which is just going into something on a hunch, and base your decisions on evidence. That evidence can be even the consultations that you had or anything else. Having said that, going back to the point that Sayyid Shabeer asked, how do we generate ideas? One exercise is to call a couple of your friends and give yourself a challenge. Say, we're going to go out to, let's say, central London today, and within 3 hours, each one of us has to come up with 2 business ideas. Look around in your environment, just look around the streets and try to just think of something that you can come up with. And ask yourself the following questions. What is the problem? What's my solution? And can I create a revenue stream from it? Problem, solution, revenue stream. Okay. Now you may come up with a really good idea, but if it can't be converted into a business model that can generate a revenue, then it's not really a business idea. It's just a good idea. But if you can think of something that can end up being converted into a business model with a revenue stream, then you're there. Try that, and you'll be surprised how many great ideas you'll come up with. And do that consistently. So if you do it this weekend, try to do it in 2 weeks, in another 2 weeks. And don't be discouraged if you can't come up with something immediately, but you will come up with some great ideas. That's one way to do it. And then we can go into defining what kind of business am I looking for. So in today's world, you could be coming up with a new idea, and it could be like Apple's iPad and iPod and smartphones. They invented something that didn't exist, right? So that could be one thing. You just come up with the most creative idea that creates something from nothing. Another way is to be a disruptor. And I would highly encourage you here, like Uber and Airbnb. Uber came to the taxi industry, and in London, it was dominated by the black cabs, highly inefficient, not so nice people, very expensive, not always available. Then came the idea of Uber. They just looked at this industry and they disrupted it. They came up with a solution that just transformed the whole industry altogether. Airbnb did the same thing for the holidays industry, right? And you can look at these two as people that came in and just looked at something that exists and transformed it. With today's technology, this is a direction that I would strongly encourage you to go in, because technology is not that expensive to start with. And there are so many areas of inefficiency that you can look at and just think, how can I reorganize this particular sector and come up with a solution? And you can see all these marketplaces online, like insurance, banking, and so many different industries have now created these marketplaces, and they use technology to do it. The final way is to just look at something that exists and not change it, but just do it better. For example, IKEA. IKEA came into the furniture industry. They didn't disrupt. They didn't invent. They just came into the sector and they found a niche and they built their position in the market. And inshallah, we can talk about strategy in this discussion.
Very good. Thank you so much, Haj Furat. I want to acknowledge those elements, and I also want to highlight a couple of more based on that. There's a really good resource that I recommend our audience to consider, which is Y Combinator. Y Combinator is an accelerator in Silicon Valley. Many of the big companies, many of which Haj Furat even mentioned, have gone through Y Combinator, and they basically figure out a way to accelerate the process of getting you to success. So Airbnb is one very famous example of several companies. But if you look through the list, you'll find a whole slew of companies that have gone through Y Combinator that have succeeded. Under Y Combinator, you have the Startup School. which gives some great insights on, product market fit and identifying the use cases of your product or your service. A very simple test that I want to invite our audience, because there's been a lot of interest in idea generation, is the pain or the gain test, right? So is your product or service offering solving a pain, number one, a pain that people have? And many times they say a hair on fire pain. It's something that people would do anything to get rid of right now. If you can solve that, you have a business. In an effective manner, you have a business. Or a gain, that is with the same amount of resources or less, somebody can get the same amount of output or more output, I should say. That's a gain test. So if you're solving that condition, that's a really, really good thing to consider. Also on this process of idea generation, it's really an exercise in thinking. Another book I'd recommend for our audience. I know that one thing that's amazing about business is actually the idea of personal growth. You may not realize it, how much you as an individual need to grow in order for your enterprise to grow. And so a byproduct of the success of your business is actually your growth, or should I say the other way around. That is that if you want your enterprise to grow, you have to grow as a person. And this is really important to note as an individual. Therefore, thinking is very important. One book I'd recommend, the average CEO reads about 60 books in America on an annual basis. The idea is, and another example of this is Charlie Munger, who's the right-hand man of Warren Buffett, one of the most affluent people consistently in the world. And he said, I've not met a single person in all of my years who's successful from a monetary perspective, at least, or successful in general, who doesn't read. The idea is even the smartest people in our society realize that you can always learn something else. But now, I should also say we should not get bogged down. That has to be applied as well. It's not that you just keep that theoretical knowledge. It's all in the execution. There's a saying in Silicon Valley that a good idea is a dime a dozen, right? You can get a good idea every single time. But the idea of understanding that, Peter Thiel in his book, Peter Thiel is one of the founders of PayPal, a very famous company that's pretty well renowned. There's actually a group called the PayPal Mafia in Silicon Valley. That's what they're known as. And these people were the people who founded PayPal or worked directly a part of that group. And they started many other businesses. So Elon Musk was part of the PayPal Mafia. Peter Thiel was part of the PayPal Mafia, and all of these other, Reid Hoffman from LinkedIn. These are all the same people in the same group. And so one thing that he argues is really thinking about in bigger terms. Haj Furat and Brother Shabbar highlighted a very important point of incremental innovation and radical innovation, right? This idea of making something, you can make something, model it and make it better, cheaper, faster. That's one type of business model. There's another one of radical innovation or disruptive innovation. And so Peter Thiel is arguing on that side. The book is called 0 to 1. The idea, he talks about this idea of horizontal innovation and vertical innovation. So horizontal innovation would be like Uber, and then you create that in different markets, such as India or Pakistan or China or otherwise. You use the same model, give it another name, and you apply it to another market. That's horizontal. That's going from 1 to N. Whereas there's another model where you're creating something that didn't exist before, 0 to 1. So that would be vertical innovation. So Uber, but we don't realize this. In Silicon Valley, 2 years before Uber, there was a company called Taxi Magic, which was the exact same thing, exact same idea, everything. Yet the market was not ripe at that time. So there's this element of luck that comes to the equation. That doesn't mean that you get lucky out of a vacuum. That means that you can do everything right and it still not work out because of some dimensions that were out of your control. As Haj Furat highlighted, the economy or something else, or the market not being there. That doesn't mean you give up, but at the same time, that does get into this idea of, that's part of the game, or that's part of the, the race, if we can call it that, and entrepreneurship at large. I've said a lot here. I'm going to turn to Brother Shabbar here on the idea of strategy. I also want to hear from Haj Furat on this, the strategy of now, once you've gotten that idea, once you've identified the idea, how do I go about executing it? And this iterative process of where do I go? Where do I start? Where do I begin to actually make this idea a reality? What would you say to someone who's saying, well, I've got this idea. I'm sitting behind my desk at my 9 to 5. I've got this idea, but now I need to execute on it. Where do I begin?
So before we go on to how do I execute this whole thing, I think we also need to appreciate that as a community, we all don't need to be the Elon Musks and the Jeff Bezos and the PayPal mafias. We can all be our own PayPal mafias in our own right, because ultimately, if you take success as being something that you have been able to do better, or you're leaving the world better than you came into, then you don't want to be Elon Musk. You can be if you wanted to. It's about doing what you give and what you can give back to the community by being an enterprise, right? So we all don't need to go down that route, but we can do if we want to. The point I'm trying to make is that as a community, we need to have building blocks. We need everybody. You need your accountants, you need your opticians, you need your dentists, you need your IT guys, you need your healthcare professionals, you need all sorts. And that mix is what creates a stronger community. And it is that mix that you need to go to first once you've had your idea or you're thinking of buying a business or starting a business. It is going to that mix. It's validating that idea of you saying, look, can I, as Brother Furat said, can I generate revenue from this? Go get advice. Somebody, and you know what? The best advice you will get is always going to see a financial advisor or an accountant, because they will look at your numbers and tell you either this makes sense or doesn't make sense. And I challenge the entire audience today, if there is one person in there that they do not know an accountant, everybody will know an accountant, or a friend will know an accountant. Go to see them to say, look, this is my idea. How do I do about it? How do I structure it? Go to somebody within the field. So when I went into healthcare, I went and spoke to people within the industry to say, listen, I'm thinking of going into this industry. What are your take homes? What is good about it? What is bad about it? And once we finished that conversation, I said, look, is there somebody else you know? Because I only knew one person. They led me to another person. Then I went and spoke to the accountant that I work with, who's a friend of mine who also does a lot of work with me, saying, look, how does this thing work? But the biggest learning from all of that is if you have to move away from theory to practice, and you've got to take the plunge at some point. But when you take the plunge, execution is key to it all. You cannot read and read and read and look at papers and write reports and write beautiful decks, but if you can't convert it into real life, it will be the biggest downfall you will have. So that is one big element. Is talk to people, look at the market, and execute. And when you're executing, and if you are employing a team of people, or even if one person, I've always said use the Google phenomena. Employ somebody who is smarter, sharper, and more intelligent than you. Because when you're in enterprise, you have to make sure you are dealing with people, and you want to have people in your team who are smarter, sharper, and more intelligent than you. Because that is where your success will lie. If you get somebody who is not that, then all you're going to get is a yes man, as I call it. And getting a yes man will get you nowhere in life. It's not easy. And I've had to go through that journey because, for example, in my healthcare, my manager has got 15 years experience and I have only got 2 years experience. But it's my job to manage that process. It's my job to manage people. And it is her job to operationally and efficiently run the business. And that's the difference.
That's very well said. I think that's really important points that have been highlighted here. And I hope the audience, and I know the audience appreciates those elements as I come to Hajj Furat, that it really depends on what is your, and I think that's a very well put point, that it really depends on knowing yourself as well. What type of business are you interested in as an individual? You may be interested in a very traditional business. You may be interested in a more intermediate business, a hybrid business. You may be interested in, for example, a cutting edge tech business. It really depends on what your interests are. I remember, and the importance of accountants, I remember Warren Buffett saying that, perhaps the most important subject you'll ever study in college is accounting, because everything has a language, so to speak. For science, it's mathematics. For business, it's accounting. That's the language of it. But this is one dimension. But somebody may say, I'm not good at accounting, or I'm not interested in the numbers and the details. Well, There are other people such as, again, Elon Musk, and the way of thinking on that front. He's a physics major, or he comes from a physics background. But one trait that he learned there that he applies everywhere is the idea of first principles thinking, boiling things down to their first principles. Why are we doing things this way? And one result that he emerged with that type of thinking that he learned from physics was, for example, rockets. Rockets traditionally were always fired into space, and 80% of it or more was ejected and would fall into the ocean and was never used again. And only a small portion of it went into space. He said, you'd never buy a car and eject 80% of it right off the bat and then never use it again and dispose of it. So he said, why can't we capture what's been ejected? And so they actually created a system to have the whatever's ejected land on a craft in the air, in the sea, and they reuse it or recycle it. But that came out of a different way of thinking. And this comes from what Peter Thiel mentioned in 0 to 1. If you want to build the future, you can't think of it looking at it as everyone else sees the current times. It requires a different way of thinking. And that's where the innovation element comes in. Another tool of value that may be a benefit to our viewers is in the same startup school, or Y Combinator, they argue that for your first 100 customers, particularly in startups, tech startups, do things that don't scale. So the example they give us Airbnb. It's a very interesting example. Airbnb's first, when they were first starting, their clientele were all in New York City. And the company, they were based in Silicon Valley. And Y Combinator asked them, well, where are your customers? They said, well, they're in New York. I said, well, what are you doing there? Go to New York. And they said, well, then they identified when spending time with them, and this goes back to what Brother Shabbar was saying, have coffees and teas and talk to people. He said, you need to talk to your customers or your potential customers or prospective customers to hear what's working, what's not working. So one of the problems they had early on in Airbnb was they had these amazing properties that were listed, but at that time, the quality of cameras were not good on phones, and they didn't have professional photography available easily. So the pictures looked very dull. And so they said, well, how can we solve this problem? So for their first 100 customers, they hired professional photographers to take pictures of those locations. Now, that is not something that's scalable easily or efficiently. It's very expensive to scale that to millions of people. But for the first people to get a critical mass, it was important to do that. So there may be these valuable tips that you can implement. And as Brother Shabbar said, execution is where everything lies. As I come to Hajj Furat, this idea of strategy and actually executing on these ideas, and this may be an ongoing conversation, right? It's not like you just set the strategy one time and it's one and done. You're constantly, the nature of business is evolution and evolving and innovation. Peter Drucker, one of the most well-known management thinkers and academics, his ideas were led to Andy Grove, who started Intel, and Andy Grove has been considered like the mayor of Silicon Valley. He created the culture that exists in Silicon Valley by helping other people out. His book, High Output Management, is what Mark Zuckerberg used to build Facebook. But Peter Drucker said, business comes down to only two things. He said, one is innovation and the other is marketing. You essentially need to have a continuously improving product that gets better and better and be able to sell it and get it in front of people. That's really the bare bones of it, in his view. So Hajj Furat, what would you say to someone about strategy, execution, and actually going about making the business work and making it tick?
What I'm hearing is three things. One from dear brother Shabbar, which is finance, and that's very important. And it's not like you have to do this first and this second. All these things are running in parallel. So if we discuss strategy after finance, it doesn't mean that you have to start with finance, then strategy. You need to do the whole thing together. What the other thing I'm hearing is agility, that you have to be flexible. And I completely support that. I attended a session with the head of HCL Infosystems, which is one of the biggest tech companies in India. They have an annual turnover of something like $5 billion US. And he said in this session that if he looks back 5 years to his company, nothing of the operations they're doing today has any connection to what they were doing 5 years ago. The company is continuously transforming itself. And of course, in tech, that's something expected. Tech accelerates at a higher rate than other industries. But the takeaway is that you can't get fixed on doing something today and expect that I'm going to be doing this for the rest of my life or for the next 5 years. You may find that 6 months down the line or 1 year down the line, you'll have to adapt. And there are so many cases of huge companies that just woke up dead one day, like Kodak, for example, because they were just not flexible enough to adapt. So being adaptable and agile is very important. The question of strategy is really the core. I do believe that it's one of the core elements of the business. And I would recommend that everyone reads a paper by Michael Porter called What is Strategy? Or just Google competitive strategy, Michael Porter, and Wikipedia probably has a summary of it. And you have to ask yourself the question that, how am I unique? Once you decide whether you're going to be the disruptor or the one that's, takes a unique position in the market like IKEA or any other business model, you have to ask yourself, how am I unique? What are the set of activities that I do that differentiate me from my competition? Once you find that and you start applying them, the next question is, how do I defend my position? So I've taken this position, now I need to defend it. I defend it by reinvesting all my resources into strategic resources. So those elements that make my company unique, I keep investing in them. So I start moving ahead of my competition. It's almost like you have to think there's somebody running after you who's going to take away your business, and you need to do everything you can to run faster before they catch you, right? And I'll give you just a couple of examples to so we can convert this into a real life example. You all know Starbucks, for example. Starbucks is a quality leader in the market. It's a premium coffee. Starbucks, for example, if you notice that their locations are always premium locations. They're always picked in the nicest places, the nicest corner, the best locations out. They have teams working day and night identifying new locations. They will never, ever go into a neighborhood or a property that is not high quality, that's not something that feeds into their branding. So that's one. Two is they invest so much into their staff. They're always friendly, nice. If you notice, they're always from a certain segment. If you go into this coffee shop for a few times, they'll know your name, right? They invest so much into their supply chain. They buy farms in Latin America. They give to these farmers what no company ever gives. So if you look at the company, and there are so many other things that they do, I'm not supporting that brand as a brand, I'm just giving it as an example. It's those unique core competencies that Starbucks has that in combination, it makes this brand unique. And they've taken a position, and it's very difficult to take that position away from them. So they're in a constant exercise to defend their brand. And of course, that's where branding also comes in. Another example is Nespresso, for example. Nespresso is owned by Nestle. It's another premium brand. They are the ones who created those beautiful machines that we all know. And they created the capsules, the coffee capsules. They sell the coffee capsules twice as high as the standard in the market. But they invest so much into their brand. They buy 1% only of the coffee beans crop worldwide. So it's a very high quality, actually. They have the Nespresso Club. They have data analytics. They can predict from your consumption habits when your coffee is going to finish. So they can send you a reminder. They have the Nespresso Club. They have those beautiful outlets that when you look at the company and all the different things that they do in combination that makes them unique, it's very difficult to take away their position. And when they started getting competition on price, they created another brand, which is the Gusto Dolce, which is a lower tier brand. And they let that brand manage the whole battle of low cost, and they maintained their premium position. And they keep investing into that position. They paid George Clooney to be their brand ambassador and so on. And there are so many other examples that we can talk about. But you need to ask yourself, when I come up with this idea, what are the core things that make me different? How can I differentiate myself? How can I protect my position? And how can I invest into this position so I can grow?
Wow. Very, very valuable stuff.
If I can just add on to what Brother Furat was saying, the core competence is your value proposition. And as Muslims, we have a very strong value proposition in any business that we're doing, right? Our proposition of integrity, our proposition of how we do business ethically, our proposition of how we treat other people, right? You're either my brother in faith or brother in humanity. These things stand well above ground. So if you look at any of the examples that Brother Furat has said, if you bring it back to our faith, you will see that our faith is propagating exactly the same thing. You don't have to be as big as Starbucks to make sure that you look after your people. You don't have to be as big as any other brand to make sure that your quality of service or your product is of the highest standard, right? Because our faith tells you you need to do that. Use that as a springboard to say that I am doing this because it is a requirement of my faith to do so, and I will proudly do so, right? And that leads you to the other bit of saying, use the community that we have, and we are blessed to have a community, as your springboard, right? So when you're doing A/B testing, whether you are piloting something, whether you are trying out something, use your community, because you know what? As a community, as a Muslim community, we are very supportive of each other, and we will always support another individual. Use that as a way to learn, but don't stop there. Otherwise, the race against yourself, you will fall off. Use them as a way to improve and iterate, creating that 1 degree change to get to a much better result.
Very, very well stated. And I think this highlights this idea of entrepreneurship, but I wanted to highlight something that kind of both of you seem to allude to, especially Haj Furat, of this idea of intrapreneurship, that is within an enterprise. If you're already working somewhere, you can start innovating there, and maybe that leads to its own endeavor, or it's something that happens internally. You know, Clayton Christensen talks about this in his book, The Innovator's Dilemma, a very, very valuable book. That's like a seminal book on this topic, that if you're running a company and it's a successful business, or it's working, and you have what's called your cash cow that gets your income. I mean, there's a lot that's said there, but I'm just giving the gist of it. Well, you have a decision there. Do I focus on innovation, or do I focus on what's getting me income in the door right now? So if you focus on what's getting you income in the door right now, you may neglect the future, and you may not innovate to get to that future. Vice versa, if you focus solely on innovation, you may be diverting attention away from your cash cow, and so you may not be able to do that. And so the crux of one of the solutions that comes from this is to consider actually spinning off and creating its own entity that's focused on innovation. Maybe that could be 1 or 2 employees under your company whose focus is solely on innovation, so they're not detracting. So you're doing quality work in every dimension. I want to give one of the companies that was mentioned just a moment ago. I remember reading about them. They had an employee who said they want this new drink that they want to start serving, and they thought it would be really good for the company. It didn't get that traction from the management. So the employee actually brought a blender from home and put it in, this is many years ago, and put it into their local shop. And they made this drink, and it started selling like absurd. And today it's called the Frappuccino, and it's known everywhere in the world. But that happened because one person took on the leadership at a low level and built this to, which was something that has become worldwide famous. And so that gives us a lesson that entrepreneurship or intrapreneurship is not dependent on 1 or 2 or a few. Rather, it's something that anyone can take this on and innovate internally to actually lead to a better environment for everyone to benefit from. So it's a way of thinking, if I can make that argument. It's not necessarily just who has the title. We talked about this a few weeks ago in leadership. You know, there's positional leadership if someone has a title of president or CEO. And there's actual true leadership that is not necessarily dependent on the title that you may have in front of your name or after your name, but actually getting things done that weren't going to be done otherwise, or actually making those things happen. I want to get into a conversation. I know time is flying by. We have some questions we need to get to as well, but this conversation around branding and marketing, this is such an important element of a company and a corporation. You know, marketing, making sure that people know you're in business, people know you're providing a service, people know that you're offering a service or a product to them, and getting in front of the right people. There's that old saying that used to be in marketing that 50% of your marketing is working, 50% is not. You just don't know which one's which. Now with the internet, that's changed a little bit, quite a bit actually, I should say, with Google and Facebook and Instagram and many other elements of the equation. But if I can come to Brother Shabbar on this one, and I'd like to hear from Haj Furat as well about marketing and branding. How important is it for a company, as well as where should someone get started on that front?
So marketing and branding, in any business you do, they are some of your key elements because they shout out what you do. Now, using your example of previously how marketing used to take place was 50% you know, 50% you don't. Actually, today, that is where the issue of the hunch comes in. We now no longer use, oh, I feel this will work, so I'm going to do it. It's about data. It's about evidence. It's about understanding two things. One is understanding your market as to who are you providing the product or service to, and then looking at the available opportunities or available resources to say which one will do best. So if you are providing a service, in my case, for a lot of older people, going onto Instagram should be last on my list. But that doesn't mean I should not be there, but it should be last on my list because my target market is different. They still read the paper and still read the magazine. However, if you are a product that is geared towards a very young market and all you are doing is putting adverts in the newspaper, and then crying that you are not getting your return on investment, clearly you're playing on a hunch or how things used to be as opposed to what is needed. So I think that is key, is making sure you have very clear crystal understanding of your target and then what you use for data for it, right? I mean, and I don't want to delve into politics, but the entire political world has been shifted based on data and trends, and marketing is exactly that. Branding becomes key to anything. If people don't know what you do or don't understand or recognize your brand, you are not going to get anywhere. They say people have to see you 4 or 5 or 7 times, your brand, enough times for them to recognize you. But branding isn't just colors and logos and all of that. It's what comes with it, right? So what does it exhume? Does it exhume quality? Does it exhume? And you can only bring about those elements of your branding by the experience that your customer has. And I come back to the point, you use the community for that experience. Because when your community sees you are providing X number of this quality and it exhumes those value proposition, your branding will start doing that. You cannot underemphasize the need to be branding and marketing, but I think it has to be warehoused in data and evidence as opposed to just throwing unlimited resources to it. And some of it is not expensive. Some of it can be done yourself. But we also make the mistake of saying, I know it all, so I'm going to do it all. And sometimes we do it, but we do it very, very badly. It's in UK we have this, it's penny wise, pound foolish. And sometimes we enter into that realm because our resources are limited. The key is how to maximize your limited resources. And that's your challenge as an entrepreneur, as a business person, is how do I maximize my limited budget?
Very, very well stated. Very well stated. So many points there about understanding the dynamics and getting it in front of the right people. I remember this idea of marketing and branding. Apple is one of the, I believe, the most valuable brands on the planet in terms of its numbers. Steve Jobs is a very interesting talk that I invite our audience to look at. He says marketing is about values, and he talks about the lesson he learned from Nike, actually, or I think you call it Nike over there, if I'm not mistaken. We call it Nike. So he was saying that, it took him 20, 30 years, it took about 20, 25 years to realize that marketing is about value. He said a company like Nike sells a commodity, shoes, like if you talk about in the framework of Porter, there's the barrier to entry is very low. You can start selling shoes tomorrow. And so it's what differentiates them. He says, well, they talk about excellence, being a champion, being a winner. And that's in our innate desire to be someone who's a champion, to be a winner. And that's what differentiates. They bring on the top athletes around the world and they associate an idea with their product. And he said when he understood that shifted everything for Apple. So what is Apple about? It's about creativity. It's about genius. It's about thinking different. And so that's the branding and the marketing approach that they've taken to implement in that corporation, in that company. But tied into this is also the idea of, well, if you have a brand, things shift. I'd invite you to think about even pricing strategy for those who are interested on this. Warby Parker is a very famous eyeglass company now. And it was 4 colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania. And they wanted, as part of their MBA project, they were trying to disrupt the eyeglass company. They were like, well, why are eyeglasses so expensive? Several years ago. And they realized that there was one family that owned all of the licensing of all eyeglasses that was running out of Europe. And they said they control the price. And they said, well, we can disrupt this model. And when they did the numbers, they said we can produce a quality eyeglass, for an individual for about $45 or so. And their professor said, don't do it for $45. You can do it at that, but don't. And the argument that they made was price is the #1 indicator of quality to the consumer. So even though if the normal price is $350 and you're selling it for $50, even though it's the same quality, they may not be able to understand that, and they may not be able to perceive that. So this is actually a lot of business understanding consumer psychology and your own psychology at large as well. And with that is doing the right thing, the ethical thing. We've given entrepreneurship examples, business examples, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're saying aspire to that. There's a problem in our world where just because someone has wealth, that necessarily means that they're a good person, or they're someone who should be looked up to. And philosophers have argued that that's not necessarily the case. Yes, there are many billionaires who have signed, for example, the giving pledge, and they're giving half of their income, which is a great thing. But coming back to this idea of marketing and branding and pricing things correctly, I wanted to come to Hajj Furat on this with respect to branding and marketing, and ultimately, which is also part of your strategy. What would you recommend to our audience about how they should go about this?
Yeah, first of all, I agree with everything that you both said. They're all very important points. And I wanted to highlight the perceived value. So branding, the more you build your brand with the right values, with all the elements that Brother Shabbar mentioned, as people start to recognize your brand, they interact with it, and they see that, you embody the values that you project. And behind that, the core service or product is coming through as promised, and with a very comprehensive and coherent communication strategy, visual ID, and all these things that feed into your brand starts to develop, and the perceived value of your brand starts to develop. And this is something that all of the companies work on. So something that costs £1, a brand can sell it for £4, a non-brand can't sell it for more than £150, because the brand, there's a perceived value that the product is better quality. It may be the same quality, but because of the branding, so it's really something very important. It protects your business. Having a strong brand becomes a barrier to entry. Number 2, it increases value. So over a span of X number of years, 5 years or 10 years, if you have a strong brand or a growing brand, that you'll see that you can outcompete your competition. And this is very important for us, because most of us are most likely not going to create Microsoft or Tesla. We're going to create, SMEs, and they're probably going to be SMEs competing in a competitive environment. And so it's really essential for you to always think long term. Where am I going to be in 5 years? And benchmark yourself against your competition. If you have a pharmacy, maybe pharmacies are making 5% per year, right? If you can make 8% over 10 years, then you'll be much bigger 10 years down the line from your competition. And you can reinvest that excess into building your brand and increasing value. So it's essential to take all the necessary steps to build a brand. And it includes actually finding a really good designer that can create a visual ID for you, and what we call like a brand manual. So, the logo, the colors, everything, that the fonts, everything that goes into it, so that whenever think of it as a dress, whenever your business goes in the public, it's dressed in a certain way, and it's dressed for the right role, the role which it presents itself as the one providing that service or product.
Very, very well stated. We've got a question here I want to get to from our audience that I'll go with Brother Shabbar on this. A question for the panel. Many having jumped into enterprise find difficulty in achieving that vital balance of life. What does the balance look like in their lives, and how do they achieve it? So, well, first of all, is there a balance? And then second, if there is, how do we go about that?
Let's put it that way. It is not easy to create a balance, but I think it's about making a conscious effort. So when you are in enterprise, or if you're in senior management, if you're working and stuff, you can be working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Your list will still not finish, right? And that is the reality. And when you're in enterprise, it's even worse because there are people depending on you. There is expectations and all sorts. But I think it's about taking that conscious effort to say, actually, I am doing this so that I have that flexibility to be able to create a balance, right? So if somebody in my position who wears multiple hats, right, I had to make those distinctions. So for me, what is important, right? And you have to make those decisions and then make time for that. So for me, it is critical that since the pandemic has started and I'm working from home, that I'm available at 3 o'clock when my kids come back from school. So I can say salam to them and I can hear them natter about what happened in the playground or what happened in school or whatever. And that 10 minutes is valuable to me and it's valuable to them. And that to me is balance. And then I go back to my work and then we finish and we all have dinner together as a family. I can afford to have that dinner together. It's ultimately, it's your own enterprise. And I think it's about mindset, as you say, Sayyid, about that actively saying, this is what I'm going to do and nothing else matters. As soon as you let that slip, you can be working day in, night out, all day long, and you will still not make a difference. And it's still not create a balance. But I think it's about forcing yourself into a routine, forcing yourself and saying, look, I will create a system and that is what I'm going to follow. And what is important? For me, the 3 o'clock is important, dinner time is important, breakfast is important, my weekends are critical, or whether that's Saturday or a Sunday. Create those protected times. Because if you don't do that, the reality is business is here, business is going to be here today and tomorrow. Given there are times and situations where you have, they flip around, but broadly in a day, there is still tomorrow to come, inshallah. We don't know, we may not be here, but if you just take a normal cycle, and you have to know that it's the only way to create a balance if you give it mental importance, I suppose, right? We all know our family is important and going to the massages is important and going for prayers in the mosque is important. But if we give it mental focus to say, this is critical to my business. And the other thing I have realized through my journey is when I take those micro gaps for 10, 15 minutes to talk to my kids and then, you know, whether we have an early dinner and then I do a bit more work or don't do it, right? It refreshes me, which means when I come back, my list is moving a lot faster. I'm not in a rut. It allows me to get out of my place, to go back in more refreshed and more energized because I suddenly see the purpose in which I'm doing it for. I know it's rather philosophical, but I think that makes it important. And it's about bite size, doing the stuff you need to do in bite size. We have a tendency sometimes to look at a project and say, I've got 1,000,001 things to do. As soon as you turn them into bite size, they become a lot more. You're able to tackle them a lot more, but balancing with family, with work, with your community engagement, and more importantly, creating time to do voluntary work. Because the satisfaction you will get, there is nothing out there that will give you that. And I think it's about creating hard borders to be able to do that.
Wow. Very, very well said. You know, having a structure in life and, you know, taking it one piece at a time. I remember reading one time that, you know, what's the best, how do you eat an elephant? And the answer is one bite at a time, right? And the idea is you just you may be overwhelmed at times, but taking one incremental step, they add up over time. And one thing that also comes to mind as I come to Hajj Furat on this is that, you know, doing what you love. Oftentimes, in a lot of entrepreneurship circles, this comes up, like, don't do it simply because of the money, because that may not get you through the journey. It may be very difficult and ardent if that's your sole motivator. Rather, look for something that, for example, you use that as a platform to help other causes, for example, or it's something that you're truly inspired by. There needs to be something bigger, a bigger calling, a bigger why, and that's something that can really drive you to get energy through the difficult times. Haj Furat, your ideas on a work-life balance. How do you do it all?
I have a very, very supporting wife, to be honest. That's the key. For me, that's the key. I'm not as disciplined as brother Shabbar. I do, yes, spend the quality time with the family. I try to have that golden time, but doesn't always work. So excuse me. My wife is very supportive, and it comes in waves. Like we said, sometimes business is very, very busy. So I have, like brother said, 18-hour days, and sometimes it's a bit slower. But then all the voluntary stuff, that drives the passion. I mean, your business has to be something that you're passionate about. I think passion feeds creativity, and it fuels you to continue. But yeah, the real passion is that, voluntary stuff, the charity stuff that you do. That's really what keeps the whole thing going. And then it depends. Sometimes you spend more time, sometimes you spend less time. But in total, I think everyone understands why everything is happening, and that's where my wife is very good at communicating these messages to the kids and to me, to give me the support that I need, and that's how it continues to survive for me. But from time to time, we take that, maybe not on a daily basis. We do have those moments, but from time to time, like short trips together. Sometimes it's a whole day out, where you really spend very, very good quality time together, and that's how it works for me.
I think, Brother Furat, it's when you're an enterprise, it's about taking those small moments and making the most of those small moments and capitalizing on those, right?
Yeah.
And also, like when I initially say, look, we are as strong as the family we are, and I think that's the point Brother Furat is saying. When the family is supportive and the family is united on a higher purpose, on a higher goal, suddenly it fits. The jigsaw fits together for that purpose.
Awesome. And everyone shares the vision, and then everyone is playing their role within that overall vision. But yeah, like capitalizing on this small bits of time is a really very good advice. Inshallah, I'll benefit from that too.
Very good. And I know we only have a few more minutes, but one question or one thing that's quite in the minds of our audience is the idea of mentorship, about, either having people that you admire that are public figures or entrepreneurs. Maybe you read about them, maybe you read about them in the news, follow their story, for example. I know everyone has this. Jeff Bezos, the Amazon CEO, founder, they say he read Made in America 100 times while he was building Amazon. Made in America is the Walmart story. I think you called it ASDA over there or something of that nature. And so that story, implementing that, and that kind of highlights that, you don't have to reinvent the wheel all the time. You can just learn from other people's lessons. So he had people, everyone has someone that they admire, either publicly or in your own circle. Maybe you have a personal mentor. Maybe you have somebody in your community, your cousin, family member, and somebody who doesn't have a mentor. What advice would you give them to get started on this? Haj Furat, if I can ask you, what advice would you give to someone on the concept of mentorship?
I think we're talking about our community. Most of us do have someone around us, whether it's a cousin, family member, neighbor, someone from the university or college where you used to go. There's always someone that you can get in touch with, that you identify, that's most relevant to the thing that you want to do. So depending on the venture, if you think hard, if you don't know someone, then network. I would strongly suggest that you start networking within the community, but also outside of the community. And inshallah, if your niyyah is right, Allah will make a way. Like, don't worry about that. As long as your niyyah is right and you go by the right principles, everything will work itself out. You just have to exert that effort. You have to put in the effort. But if you think hard, look around you, you'll find them. And if you don't, then just ask someone who may refer you to someone that might help. But it's essential to identify 2 to 3 people, use them as mentors / consultants, and be consistent. Don't consult once and then never come back for the next 8 months. Then the value of the first consultation will just wear off. It needs to be consistent. They need to know also where you are, so they can plugged into your journey, and they can continuously follow up and give you more. They will be more engaged and bought into your whole project as well if you do that on a consistent manner.
Very good. Consistency is key. Brother Shabbar.
Name of the game. Consistency.
Name of the game.
Name of the game.
Execution, consistency. Brother Shabbar, mentorship. What advice would you give someone on this?
100%. Whilst I agree that we can read about all these people that we aspire to be and this, at the end of, I believe in what I call the grassroots movement. It's the friends you have, it's the friend's friend, it's people within your community. It is key. If you just keep on talking to people, you keep on talking to your friends and to your friends' friends, they will give you the biggest insight you will ever get. And ultimately, they will tell you things that the mistakes they have made that they shouldn't make. So people come to me for advice, and I tell them, listen, this is my journey. And I've openly said it to a lot of people who said I should have gone into business 10 years earlier. That was my learning. And I'm telling people they shouldn't have that learning, right? And same thing like that. There is, talk to the people closest to you, and you'll be surprised how much you'll be able to learn from them. You cannot underemphasize the need of mentorship and of building genuine, as Brother Furat said, genuine relationship with people, because you can learn from anybody. It doesn't have to be somebody who's very good at that, because life is full of experiences. So 100%.
Very, very well stated. I'm going to take a last statement from our respective guests on their final parting words for the road, for the journey for entrepreneurs. What final advice would they give to them? But a final point that I want to mention is one thing that often comes up is it's not necessarily a good idea to just go to someone, give them your business idea and say, is this a good idea? Many times, if you use this, they may not have the tools to know if it's a good idea or not. They may not be in that market. There's been countless stories of brilliant ideas that may have been told to friends and family who mean well, but they don't know about the problem enough. So one thing that's really recommended is don't lead the jury on. First identify the problem. What is the true problem? Really ask that question rather than giving your idea straight away. And by the answers, the honest answers you get, then you infer that was this solution that I presented in the right solution. But I guess we're out of time. I just want to get a final statement from Brother Shabbar. If I can ask you, what advice, what would you say for the entrepreneur setting out on this journey? Words of wisdom.
So my words of wisdom is do it. It's going to be hard, but you will get through it. More importantly, remember why you are doing this. And the bigger and ultimate purpose always has to be that we are doing this so that we can serve the awaited Savior when he comes. We can say, here is my contribution to your cause.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Hajj Furat.
I would build on what my brother said, and I would say, ask yourself this question. Are you ready to receive the Imam in your office, our beloved Imam in your office? And if the answer is yes at any time, then you're on the right track. If it's no, I'm not ready at this moment, then ask yourself why.
Beautiful. What an ending to the show. Well, thank you so much, Hajj Furat, Brother Shabbar. Thank you so much for being on board. We really, really appreciate your time, your insights, invaluable insights, I should say. And to our beloved audience, thank you for tuning in. We hope you've found this valuable, and I'm sure you have. Please do tune in to our next conversation next week, inshallah. And we hope to build this virtuous community together. Thank you so much. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you.